Okay, so I wanted to make a video about sidearms. That's what this video is going to be about. You can see I've got a couple of sidearms in my inventory already. That's what this is going to be about. The main reason why I'm making this video in the first place is because there's kind of a big disparity between the way that sidearms feel on mouse and keyboard versus the way that they feel on controller. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's important to have viable weapons on different input devices, and PC has long been reputed for having a different feel for weapons, like hand cannons, snipers as well are a little bit different. Shotguns feel pretty different, fusions, SMGs, there's a bunch of stuff that feels different in the game, depending on the input device that you're using. And the main reason why sidearms feel so different on mouse and keyboard versus, excuse me, I have some gas, on controller, I didn't have to burp, I lucked out. So the reason why they feel so different between mouse and keyboard and controller is because of the way that aim assist works towards bullet magnetism and hit registration, all that kind of stuff. So, aim assist will assist your bullets towards the, well, one, it'll make sure that your, excuse me, it'll make sure that your aim stays on target, or at least adhere to the hitbox. That's called hitbox stick, I think, by some people. But you can get what's called aim assist drag, and that's where your reticle will be on the edge of a hitbox and drag onto a hitbox, or your aim will be dragged away from another hitbox by somebody passing your line of fire if you're using something like a controller that has aim assist. That's something that you can experience on weapons that have a high aim assist value. It can happen on snipers, it can happen on shotguns. It doesn't matter what type of weapon it happens to, it can still happen to it so long as the aim assist value is pretty high. Now, sidearms have gotten a recent buff lately on all platforms. Their hit registration has been increased and their aim assist has been increased. The aim assist increased has been much more beneficial to controllers than it has been on mouse and keyboard. Now, what I'm trying to show in the background, Devil's Ruin is one of the sidearms that I really like using on mouse and keyboard. It's one of the few that I actually find I like. But what we're doing is we're kind of looking at the hitbox, at the locations where the hitbox is still not the hitbox, and also where it is the hitbox. We're trying to locate on these different ads like what the hitbox looks like, and at a pretty fixed range. So we're at 20 yards out or 20 meters out from this location. Like I think that's like, what is that? Like 36 yards, something like that. Maybe 32. I don't know. But we're 20 meters out. No, it's not that. It's like it doesn't matter. I'm not here to do conversions. So we are 20 meters out, and I think 12 meters away from the second group of ads. So the hitbox is much more forgiving when you're within that 12 to 19 range, 19 meter range. That's kind of like the optimal range for sidearms, and you can see how forgiving the hitbox is once you get within a certain range compared to the longer range hitbox where it really narrows down. Now, I'm going to do some moving around stuff later on in the video so you can see kind of what like the hitboxes look like when you have like a little bit of a simulated gameplay. It's not 100% simulated because PvP hitboxes tend to be a little bit different than the PvE hitboxes as well. But this is to show how tight the actual hitbox can be when you're outside of a weapon's viable range. Now, these ads, or enemies, are at a pretty reasonable range for most hand cannons. I think that's like pretty optimal range for spare rations right there. So as far as primaries are concerned, the hit registration and requisite for accuracy on some of these sidearms is extreme. And that makes it very difficult to use them because you don't have some of those factors that are helping you. But if you step into their range a little bit more, then there's a lot more generous magnetism. So you can see, again, we're just kind of lining up right at 20, and it was 12 meters out from those. Okay. So you can see the disparity between different archetypes of sidearms, and that the disparity between the range. and how that affects the hitbox. Now this sidearm in the background has rapid hit and multi-kill clip. Rapid hit on hand cannons has been found to increase the stability and therefore the aim assist or bullet magnetism, or it reduces the effect of bloom by virtue of maintaining a more stable hitbox. So you can see that at this range, hand cannons are pretty contestable. They have like a really nice magnetism at this range, hand cannons do. Whereas with a sidearm, you have to be a little bit more accurate than you would be with a hand cannon. You still have to like aim with a hand cannon, and the hitboxes can be pretty unforgiving, as you can see. This is not a bad roll on an Austringer, by the way. But it's easier to be accurate at this range with a hand cannon than it is to be with a sidearm. Now, I don't know, because it's been a while since I've played on controller with a sidearm, how it compares at this range. But you notice a lot when you switch over to something like a 3-burst sidearm, and I think I'm going to show that right now. Yeah, so we're going to get out some of these last hopes. These are pretty good last hopes. And there's a good reason why I have these two for testing. One has rangefinder and one doesn't. And rangefinder increases the zoom. But that's what I wanted to talk about here, is the way that the zoom and the recoil pattern is going to affect that outer distance range and target acquisition when you don't have hitbox stickiness. So one of the things that you can note is that it's hitting all crits so long as basically the reticle is lined up at about the eye level of the hitbox. But even while aiming kind of towards the hitbox, just below it, the recoil pattern is deviating up into the visual hitbox, but still not registering crits all the time. It will do it occasionally, but the actual recoil pattern doesn't always recoil up into the crit spot. It does sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's because we're at the outer extremes of the range viability of this sidearm archetype. So what I'm trying to do is try and find the fidelity of the hitbox for this archetype of weapon. Finding that is really important because that's going to indicate how consistent the weapon is going to be. Now, if you play with it in its range, you can see that it's very consistent and it's hitting where it should be. But it also has a level of inconsistency or unforgivability. Not inconsistency, but it is also a little unforgiving. Even if it looks like the reticle is on the head, it might still register as a body, and that makes this weapon archetype a little inconsistent when you're using it in high-stress situations like PvP. So that means that you kind of have to spam your shots. But if the hit registration is a little unforgiving, that makes it kind of a weapon archetype that you're not going to want to use depending on the type of input device that you're using. Now again, like I said, I don't know what it feels like to use a controller on these weapons anymore because I've been playing mouse and keyboard for about 2.5 months now. But it is definitely a different experience. So it's not like you can't hit crits at this distance, it's just that in simulation, when you're simulating a gunfight like I'm doing in the background, it looks like you might be hitting crits, but you're still hitting bodies at this range. Now, is that the range? Is that the hitbox? Is that something else? Is there a factor there? Is it bullet magnetism? Or is it just that the hitbox is actually just that for unforgiving at certain ranges? We're going to re-simulate this movement and kind of PvP movement a little bit later at a closer range, and you're going to see much more consistency. But then we're going to draw the comparison between a sidearm and that kind of inconsistency versus using like a shotgun. Now, Devil's Ruin is a 300 RPM, which makes it an adaptive frame sidearm. You can see that there is a requisite for accuracy still, but if you can be accurate with it, it does feel pretty rewarding, and it has 51 damage to the head, which puts it in the same damage bracket as like the Last Word. But because it's a 300 RPM, it has a faster TTK if you can hit all crits. So I think the justification behind the crit box, the way that it is on mouse and keyboard, is that you have a higher propensity to be accurate and to control recoil and to control variance in the way that the game performs in high-stress environments. And that's why it can be justified to have a really aggressive TTK at competitive ranges with weapons like hand cannons, because on mouse and keyboard the hand cannon might be more consistent, whereas on controller the sidearm might be more consistent. So I think that that's kind of an interesting duality that you can see in the sandbox. And the reason why I really want to draw on that comparison is to namely say that if you play on controller, you have no reason not to be using a sidearm. Because sidearms are legitimately better than hand cannons, especially with the changes that have come to their aim assist and target acquisition due to the method of aim assist and the nature of aim assist in Destiny 2, especially when you're making a comparison between mouse and keyboard, which has very little aim assist. In fact, it has no aim assist, it just has magnetism. So the weapons have aim assist built into them, which is the propensity for the bullets to target the head, but it doesn't have the system built into it where you will get like stick drag or cursor drag or magnetism from your cursor, where the computer is processing some of the aim for you, which is what you do have on controller, and that's to make up for the limited aspect of controlling reticle with your thumb as opposed to in your entire hand. So that is the difference between why you would probably see this kind of disparity between these archetypes of weapons between mouse and keyboard and controller. And this is nothing new. So this is something that happened with Lunas and Not Forgotten and hand cannons. During the Lunas Not Forgotten meta, Lunas and Not Forgotten had to be nerfed because of the way that they were performing on console, where there were controllers only, or possibly Zims. But the reason is because they were the only consistent hand cannons, whereas on PC, you would see Ace of Spades because it had the highest range. So the disparity between the two is much different. The accuracy requisite on mouse and keyboard is more important for hand cannons. So Not Forgotten was actually a weapon that was sort of in check on PC. On controller, it was not. There was nothing that could contend with it because the range and the way that the recoil pattern worked, and because of the way that the perk worked as well, and because of the way that aim assist worked on controllers with Not Forgotten, it became a non-choice and a non-competitive, and it became a hyper-competitive weapon because nothing could compete with it. So now we're kind of seeing this sort of trend form between the viable weapons on controller and the viable weapons on mouse and keyboard. Now that hand cannons have kind of been nerfed and their range has been reined in, we're seeing a lot of buffs coming to alternative weapons like auto rifles, which have a pretty decent aim assist stick value to them, and we're also seeing it with sidearms here. So that's why I wanted to use these visuals to indicate that. Now see how much more forgiving the range is when you kind of step past that 20-meter mark. So now we're kind of in like the outer extents of the chaperone range right at this point. This is kind of like the outer limits of slug shotguns and a lot of other close range special weapons like adaptive frame fusion rifles and things like that. And this is where the sidearms really start to shine. So you can take chaperone, which has like a 13-meter, 14, 15-meter range. It pushes like 15 meters plus maybe with the Roadborne, and like Charged with Light it might hit 16. If you've got a lucky crit and a low resilience guardian, you might actually pop that shot. But that's about the effective range where sidearms start to become way more consistent and way more effective, even on mouse and keyboard. The hit registration at around that 12 to like 15, 18, 19 meter range is where they're really good. So that's why I was actually stepped back at about 20 meters. So I did kind of like a reverse test with this visual to show kind of like the outer limits of sidearms. But the reason why I did that is because you would probably be using a sidearm as your primary to contend with things like hand cannons, and then you would use the sidearm as a backup weapon to like a snipe, or maybe even a fusion rifle, something like that. But seeing the outer limits of the sidearm and the way that the hitbox works in this experiment is very important. It helps you kind of understand why the meta is the way that it is on PC, why people use shotguns kind of predominantly, because the hit registration on sidearms is very different than it is on something like controller or console. So if you do use controller and you do play on PC and you're tired of dealing with shotguns or whatever, put on a sidearm. Like if you can use your mobility really well, sidearms are fantastic right now. But the reason why you do see so many shotguns, so many snipers, and so many hand cannons is because those are just the weapons that feel good on the input device that the predominant player base is using. That's why those weapons are just so prevalent. You don't see a lot of auto rifles, you don't see a lot of beam rifles, you don't see a lot of that stuff because the aim assist just isn't there. The magnetism just isn't there. The requisite for accuracy is very high and very penalizing if you're not on point with your shot. And the range does affect the magnetism, so that's why it seems so inconsistent. So that's my thing on sidearms.